Morning everyone, I'm Maisie and I'm joined by my colleague Mia today, and we both work for Panoramic Associates, as you may know, and we specialise in public health recruitment, mainly for local authorities and the wider public sector, with much of the work that we do being focused around sort of substance misuse commissioning and drugs and alcohol. And if you came to our last one, we were joined by Stuart Green, who covered the topic of LEROs. Stuart was meant to be joining us with David today, but unfortunately he's unwell and off work at the moment. But we're lucky to still be joined by David, who will be giving us a presentation on recovery capital and recovery cities. And the areas that he will be covering include recovery science, recovery capital, and from LEROs to IRC. I'll just pass you over to Mia, who will just sort of take you through some of the ground rules, and then we'll pass over to David and get started.
Brilliant. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your attendance. Just a small bit of housekeeping. So we would appreciate it if everyone stays on mute throughout the session, just mainly because of the background noise, but feel free to turn your camera on. It's great to see so many faces. Please put any questions into the chat box as we go through. David will be running through his presentation to approximately kind of 9 o'clock or just before. That leaves us plenty of time, up to 30 minutes for Q&A. We're hoping that session will be as interactive as possible. So at that point, please raise your hand using the application below. There you go, I'll demo it, or just simply take yourself off mute and ask your question. This session will be recorded, so if you have to pop out early or anything like that, then we can send you the full recording afterwards. But that's pretty much it. So thank you again, and I'll hand you over to David Best.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining at this early hour of the day. My name's David Best. I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. So I am Professor of Addiction Recovery at Leeds Trinity University. I also work some of the time in Australia and America and Canada. A little bit just around my background. So I am a psychologist by background. I did my training at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, and I've worked among other places for the National Treatment Agency for Substance Misuse. And while I was there, I was seconded to do a priority review of drug treatment effectiveness for the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. Basically, what I'm saying is I'm incredibly old, and I've worked in the addictions field for roughly 200 years. So I've seen all kinds of changes in the field in that time. And I guess, much of what the other thing that I should say is, and from a personal point of view, I was brought up in a household where my father was an alcoholic. So I have lived experience of being an affected other from a very early age in life. And I guess one of the things that really my career has spanned has been the transition from a very traditional acute clinical model of addictions to a much more chronically focused and recovery focused model of how things have changed over time. And I'll say a little bit about that as I go on. And I think one of the most important things that has happened is that when I started in my career, the notion of recovery would have been slightly scoffed at. People would typically have said, it's all wishful thinking. If it happens at all, it happens to people who are really lucky. And any talk of spiritual awakening or collective purpose or meaning would have been dismissed as unscientific and unrealistic. Well, for that reason, I'm going to start. The first thing I'm going to talk about, as Maisie said, is I'm going to say a little bit about recovery science. And then I think for me, what was the big game changer in my career was the concept of recovery capital. Because effectively what recovery capital does is it gives us a scientific way of counting and measuring strength-based approaches. And that for me is crucial. And I think there are effectively 3 phases in the development of a recovery model in the UK. And I'll talk through them. And they really culminate with 2 things. The lived experience recovery organisations and our own College of Lived Experience Recovery organisations, and the emergence of the inclusive recovery cities model, which I think is such an important thing moving forward. So to get going and move forward with this. Let's start with some stuff about recovery science. And fundamentally, on this slide, really, the top three things are kind of what you need to know. I mean, I feel a little bit of a fraud having said I've worked for 200 years and the best I can come up with is jobs, friends and houses, or somewhere to live, someone to love and something to do. But fundamentally, that is the basic bottom line of our understanding of what the key elements are. And there's two underpinning statistics to this. And rather unimpressively, I'm going to read them the wrong way around. When Sheedy and Whitter, who did a review for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the United States in 2009, they summarized the evidence of long-term recovery. And essentially, they concluded, based on something like 400 studies, that of all the people who have a lifetime substance use disorder, 58% will eventually achieve stable recovery. Now, that's a remarkably high statistic. And just going back about 15 years, I did some work in North Wales, and I didn't show this statistic. No, it couldn't have been 15 years ago, because the study's not that old, 10 years ago. And I asked drug workers in North Wales to estimate what they thought the percentage of people who achieved stable recovery was. The average estimate was 7%. So we are in what's called a clinical fallacy, that people who work in services that only see people who never leave their services or who are in a revolving door in and out of services have a very pessimistic prognosis of the likelihood of recovery. Now, to flip to the left-hand side, what do we mean by stable recovery? So stable recovery was defined first by Mike Dennis from the Chestnut Health Institute in the United States, and then included in the Betty Ford Institute consensus group definition of recovery as meaning 5 years of continuous sobriety. And that includes medicated use. So people could be on a substitute prescription for that time, but no use of alcohol or illicit drugs. Why 5 years? Because in the first year after somebody stops, typically the estimates are that the relapse risk is between 50 and 70%. When they get to 5 years, the relapse risk is around 14% and doesn't go any lower. And that's not dissimilar to general population rates. So we would say that's pretty much stable recovery. And so essentially what we think of now is that whatever the levels of acute intervention that are offered, substitution, prescriptions, talking therapies, detoxification, rehabilitation, beyond that, there is a 5-year window typically for people to achieve stability in their recovery. And essentially, to some extent, the recovery movement can be summarized as, what do we do to support people through that 5-year window of time? And like all academics, I have shamelessly stolen from the mental health recovery field their summary of what the evidence base would suggest. And in 2011, Mary Leamy and colleagues published a wonderful review article of what works in recovery. And so effectively, this is what the common elements of mental health recovery interventions. And they came up with an acronym, CHIME, which was just fabulous to summarize what were the key essential elements of an effective recovery-oriented service or system. And the elements were connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And look, in the course of my career, I've collected about 3,500 recovery stories. And the one thing they all have in common is nobody does it alone. Nobody does it alone. It always starts with a fundamental human connection. And if you work in or commission specialist services, the first thing you need to think about is, to what extent do those services create the conditions that make genuine, meaningful human connection likely? And we saw with transforming rehabilitation that probation services changed in such a way it became almost impossible with their kind of telephone-based form-filling mandate with huge client loads. The likelihood of connection, genuine, meaningful connection there became negligible. It's not possible. The other thing, which I will come back to, is the primary mechanism for change is peer-based. How do people recover? Through the social contagion of recovery, but more of that anon. So connection, positive connection, generates the hope that change is possible, and that then creates a virtuous circle of meaningful activities, positive identity, and empowerment. Now, very sadly, the letters in CHIME are slightly in the wrong order. It should actually be CHIMAI. That doesn't make such a good acronym. So really, it's positive connection, typically through seeing a peer who has done something similar. And the fundamental mechanism is, I want what you have, and I'll do what you do to have what you have. So this is fundamental Bandura social learning principles. It's effectively social learning and social control. That belief, if you can do it, I can do it, generates the hope that gets people moving, that gets them involved in meaningful activities. And I'm currently involved in a project in Massachusetts in America called Recovery Works. And there, what we're doing is essentially trying to get people back into employment, back into meaningful employment. And the model they are using is fundamentally about peer-based mentoring and coaching to create those conditions that allow people to get, and what people will frequently talk about at the start of that employment journey is, in the first year, it's what's referred to in America as a get well job. In other words, a job that gets you out of bed and gets you used to turning up 9 to 5. So the M at the start of your 5 years of a recovery journey is to give your days structure and purpose. But that should change. By the time you get to 5 years, M takes on a much more existential quality. It's about a genuine purpose in life. And that might be to do with spirituality or religion. It might be to do with family and looking after your children. For a lot of people, it's about giving back and getting a job in the addictions field that allows them to, in some ways, repay what they perceive as their debts. But effectively, the key transition is, it may be perfectly acceptable to be working in Tesco's in your first year, but ideally by year 5, you'll be doing something that gives you a positive sense of identity and meaning. And obviously that might be being the chief executive of Tesco's 5 years later. Who's to say? So first acronym is CHIME. Second acronym is Goya. So the first big study of recovery I did now 12 years ago was we looked at 198 people in recovery from heroin addiction and alcoholism in Glasgow and Birmingham. And there were 2 predictors of well-being in recovery. The first was the more time you spent with other people. And to our surprise, the second was how much time you spent actually engaged in the following list of activities: childcare, engaging community groups, volunteering, education, training, and employment. Now, from these, we came up with the acronym Goya, and I know it's early in the morning for complex scientific terms, but Goya stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. That essentially, this is fundamentally about activity, and there are 3 golden threads to all recovery studies. Connection, fundamental human connection, which is the first point. Meaningful activities and a purpose in life is the second, and underpinning them is a safe place to live that's free from threat. They are the 3 golden threads of all recovery models and processes. And this fabulously meaningless graph is a structured equation model. So the first study I did was from Birmingham and Glasgow. This is from recovery residences in Florida. And I don't, well, to be honest, I don't really understand the maths in this. But anyway, there are 2 pathways to recovery. So you start from the bottom left. And as with any treatment service, the longer time people spent in recovery residences, the less barriers there were to recovery and the less unmet needs they had. But if people use the time in recovery residences to engage in meaningful activities, there is a second pathway that's the first vertical line up from time in residence, which is, if you use that time to engage in more meaningful activities, there is then a strength-based approach. And I will definitely come back to the whole issue of recovery capital. But effectively, when people engaged in recovery in meaningful activities, they started to develop positive strengths in personal areas and in social areas. And that led to a much more kind of strengths-based pathway to building their recovery capital. Now, I am now going to argue something that quite often provokes kind of sneering or laughter. And the argument I'm going to introduce here, which is a fundamental change to the science, is that recovery is not about getting back to where you started. People in recovery, it's about being better than well. So if you look at this chart, and ignore the bit on the left, because the bit I really want to focus on is firstly, so this is from the UK Life and Recovery Survey, which we did in 2015 when I was at Sheffield Hallam University. And what we found was that 74% of people in long-term recovery remain steadily employed. So there's a massive change in employment rate, nearly doubling. But the crucial statistic is the one on the top right-hand side. 79% of people in long-term recovery have actively volunteered and contributed to their community well-being since the start of their recovery journey. Now, I thought, isn't that interesting? I wonder what the rate is for the general public who've never been addicted. And the rate, 39%. So if you want to live in a connected community, it is twice as good for you to live next to people who are in long-term recovery than it is to live next to people who have never been addicted. And linked to findings we've had on quality of life, particularly social quality of life, people in long-term recovery are what we refer to as better than well. They will typically score higher on the WHO Brief Quality of Life Inventory than people who never had addiction problems in the first place. And this is not dissimilar to findings in the area of post-traumatic growth. People who overcome significant adversity typically have better well-being than people who were never addicted in the first place. And I will come back to the significance of this shortly. But there's one more study that I'm going to mention in this section, which is something we only recently completed. So I was lucky enough to lead a European study looking at recovery pathways in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands, funded through the Horizon 2020 funding pot. And what we did basically was we took a big number of people and we screened them, and then we took 313 people and we followed them first over 1 year and then over a second year. But essentially what we were looking at was, what is the rates of relapse? And we deliberately recruited people who at the start of the study were in early recovery or sustained recovery or stable recovery. So overall, men were more likely to relapse than women. However, of people in early recovery, 1/3 of them relapsed in the year of our study. Of people in stable recovery who had 5 years already at the start of the study, 1.5% relapsed in the year of our study. In other words, 1 in 65 relapsed. And tiny rate that would be way below the population rates. So we provided ongoing further evidence that effectively there's a Hobbesian social contract. Getting people into long-term stable recovery is highly protective. And what we found was that people whose recovery journey included peer-based support services did better than people whose journeys only included professional services. But replicating a finding that had been reported in America by Fiorentini about 25 years ago, people who went to both peer-based services and professional specialist services did better than people who only went to one or the other. In other words, there's additive value. And we've known for a long time that people who go to 12-step groups and who go to specialist treatment services do better than people who only go to one of them. The last finding, we got some extra money from the Economic and Social Research Council to follow people the year after COVID, the first year of lockdown, and their relapse rates were actually lower at that time. So enough research and study. Recovery capital. Let me just start by, why is this important? So many of you, if you use outcome monitoring, will measure things that measure deficits, that measure bad things that happen in people's lives. So the Maudsley Addiction Profile, which I'm one of the authors, the Addiction Severity Index, and so on. The whole idea of a recovery science is we want to measure not what people are bad at, but what their strengths are. And I think one of the big challenges for commissioners and anyone else getting their head around a recovery model is it's a fundamental paradigm shift. So things change completely. So the first thing is you move from an expert patient model. In other words, I sit and dispense wisdom, you sit and listen and do what you're told, to a partnership model. The recovery journey is very much a journey of equivalence and equity. The second part of this is it's a move from deficits to strengths. So I don't know, but 20 years ago, I used to occasionally run a brief assessment clinic at the Stockwell Project in Brixton in South London. And I'd sit for half an hour with a questionnaire in front of me and say to people, right, who I'd never met before, tell me about your drug problems, your crime problems, your family problems, your relationship problems, your physical health problems, your mental health problems, your housing problems. Oh, and incidentally, how many people have you done unprotected sex with in the last month? And how many people have you shared injecting equipment with in the last month? It was denigrating, pathologizing, stigmatizing, and it created a power differential, because if at any point the participant had said to me, why, how many people have you had unprotected sex with in the last month? I'd have said, none of your fucking business, answer the question. It's an inequity of power. And one of the things of a recovery model is we switch to a model where we say it's about strengths. We are much more interested in what you want and what you're going and where you see your goals than this list of pathologizing. The next thing that I think is crucial to say is the location of change is not assumed to be the clinic. So when I worked at the Maudsley, we saw people on average once a fortnight for 45 minutes in community services. And you cannot assume that you somehow sprinkle magic dust on people that protects them. The location of change is the home, the social network, the family, the community, not the clinic. And one of the other things that I think is hard for people sometimes to get their heads around is that recovery is not something that happens inside people's heads or bodies. It is a fundamentally intrinsically social process. It is something that is out there. And I guess linked to that, it's fundamentally peer-based. So in 2013, I asked Keith Humphreys, who is the professor of addiction medicine at Yale, to review the evidence base for the Journal Drug and Alcohol Review about what works in recovery. And he came up with 3 things there was unequivocal evidence about. Recovery housing in Oxford houses, 12-step mutual aid groups, and peer-delivered interventions. What do they all have in common? They are all peer-delivered interventions. So the fundamental shift is from the primacy of the professional to the primacy of the peer. The transition from the clinic to the community. And crucially, the last point, which is not great for scientists like myself, is replication is not the same. So in other words, what do I mean by that? Well, if I came up with a perfect detox model, it wouldn't matter whether I was in Derbyshire, where I am, in Glasgow, where I come from, in Melbourne, in New York, in Sydney, it wouldn't matter because it's a technique. But recovery doesn't work like that. Individual recovery is embedded in social networks and access to community resources. It can only happen in that kind of context. So, what is recovery capital? Recovery capital effectively is a way of us counting and quantifying strengths. So it was originally defined as by Granfield and Cloud as the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. And crucially, in the same year, the great William White and William Cloud concluded, stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of strengths, not on the basis of pathologies, comorbidities, dual diagnosis, severity of drug problems, none of that stuff. And in 2010, I published a paper, which is the first attempt really at quantifying recovery capital with Alexandra Lodi, and we did this for the Royal Society for the Arts in London. And we started saying, right, look, what are the things people need to get to at the end of the recovery journey? We came up with an initial bundle of personal recovery capital qualities, which were self-esteem, self-efficacy, resilience, coping skills, and communication skills. But, and crucially, how people get there in a recovery model is different. How they build those things over that 5 years of the recovery journey is partly down to who they spend time with, and partly down to what resources they can access in the community. And effectively, what we originally called collective recovery capital, we now call community recovery capital. But social and community resources provide the scaffolding around a person that gives them the time and space to build those resources. Now, since that time, in the ensuing 23 years, much of my work, 13 years, has really been dedicated to trying to work out how do we count recovery capital. And I've since developed a measure called the RECCAP. And the RECCAP is an online platform where we now have more than 20,000 completed forms, and it's used in 7 states across America, and in Virginia and in Michigan. You don't get state funding for recovery housing unless you use it. Why? Because it gives you a strengths-based model, traffic lighted model. So the moment the client fills in the RECCAP, which they can do on their phone, they can do it on their laptop, they get a personalized score profile that informs recovery care planning. And gradually over time, we are starting to build a model of how the evidence works. So the first thing we've been able to do is to show how recovery capital at baseline predicts retention. So this was based in a large recovery residence in Florida, how it predicts change. And you will see that, as I argued at the start, what predicts positive change in recovery capital? Jobs, friends, and houses. Work, greater community involvement and social support, less housing instability. Jobs, friends, and houses. All recovery talks should and will come back to these same themes. And now we're starting to embed this in criminal justice settings. So we've got a paper that's just about to be published where we look at starting in therapeutic communities in jail and following people into recovery residences. We can show the same positive trajectory of recovery capital growth. And this is a bridging the gap study effectively, because what we're doing here is showing that positive changes in a prison setting can effectively be managed and documented. And we're trying to use this as a model. So we now have a pathway. So this slide gives recovery capital scores over time. And essentially, this is based on about 22,000 people in the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and America. So why is that important? Well, it allows us to start to say, this is the expected trajectory of growth in recovery capital in people. As I said, one of the crucial things for me has been the emergence and developments of a recovery capital science. So what it allows us to do is to start to say, this is a typical pathway, but what could we do to intervene if there are deficits in this pathway? So it's same graph, but split up. So in 2008, the people who originally came up with the term recovery capital, Robert Granfield and Robert Cloud, argued that there's such a thing as negative recovery capital that constitutes barriers. And somewhat contentiously at that time, they argued there were 4 things that blocked people's recovery journeys. They were mental health problems, not surprisingly, serious mental health, experience of incarceration, not surprisingly, but much more contentiously, being older and being female. Now, Ben, I know you've got your hand up. I hope you don't mind if we just wait to the end and then we'll deal with questions then. So much more contentiously, they argued that being a woman was a barrier to recovery and that being older was a barrier to recovery. So with the data we've got, we effectively we were able to test this model, and we added up how many out of 4 all of our 22,000 people had. And bizarrely, Granfield and Cloud are right, that you can see the trajectories that for people who have all 4 of those characteristics, they're older, they're women, they've been in prison, and they've got serious mental health problems. That's the pale blue line at the bottom of the graph. They start worse and they don't recover the gap or the deficit. People who have none or only one of those issues, which are the top 2 lines, the darker blue and the orange line, they do much better and they stay significantly higher. And it's almost stepwise. So whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, Granfield and Cloud were right. And we've known for a long time, the older people are when they start their recovery journeys, the harder it is for them. Essentially, this is about they have typically burnt too many of their recovery resources. Being female is generally regarded as a barrier in terms of societal response, partly about increased stigma frequently around parenting, childcare, children in care. We also know that women who in long-term recovery typically have more unresolved trauma and more unresolved psychological health problems. So there is explanations, but we're still trying to get to the bottom of what this is about. We're also developing currently something called the Recovery Capital Screener tool. So a much briefer 36-item tool that measures, and all of the questions are on there, that measures the purple band is personal capital, the blue band is social capital, and the green band is community capital. And again, you can do it on your phone or you can do it on your iPad. And cunningly enough, it links to, we have an intervention linked to this that sets of playing cards that allow you to kind of turn this into an intervention. So this is an exciting new development for me in this area, where we're starting to work through this model. But I want to conclude the section on recovery capital with a quote from somebody who is my kind of academic mentor and guru. So one of the jobs I have is I'm an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University in Canberra. And the founder of that unit is a great academic called John Braithwaite. And John Braithwaite last year published an amazing book called Macrocriminology and Freedom. And this quote is taken from this. So the quote, social capital, human capital, recovery capital, and restorative capital are unlike financial capital in that they are not depleted through use. When you spend your money from the bank, you deplete your capital. When you trust someone, you do not deplete trust. Trust tends to be reciprocated, and this engenders virtuous circles of trust building. A politics of hope is likewise redemptive. As we face adversity, it is infectious. Why the hell am I telling you this? Because the transition, the historical transition of models goes from addiction as an individualized, personalized pathology. As we moved to recovery housing in the United States, residential rehabs, therapeutic communities, people started referring to this as a social model of recovery. But what I think is happening here in John Braithwaite's quote and in my research is the third phase of this is what we need to refer to as an ecological model of recovery. Because when recovery is transmitted from one person to another through the social contagion of hope, there is residual benefit. There is a residue of positive recovery capital in the community. The community does not remain neutral. The community gains from this. And that is the idea that I will explore in the last section. But before I do that, I'm going to say something about what happens with LEROs. And I'm going to try and not sound bitter when I do this, because they're massively encouraged by Dame Carol Black, and I'm not sure how much of this Stuart will already have told you. And the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations was founded right at the start of COVID. And we started Clero with 3 very clear aims, and they're all on this slide. They are, move this over. They are around evidence, innovation, and standards. So when we started, we were really conscious of the fact that commissioners and government were highly sceptical about recovery organisations. They were seen as doing fluffy stuff on the margins of what's important in the treatment world. And so we set up this group, and I think there were 12 of us to start with. So there was myself and Ed Day, who's the National Recovery Champion, plus 9 or 10 people who ran lived experience recovery organisations across the UK, including Stuart. And what we did was we basically met every 2 weeks to try and identify how we could start to develop an evidence base for LEROs, how we could chart out some of the innovation, and how we could develop standards. But one of the things we quickly realised was we became a support organisation, that people who run lived experience recovery organisations are frequently pretty isolated, and there is no manual or textbook on how to do it. And the science, which I hope I've gone some way to demonstrate, is slowly developing. And encouraged by Dame Carol Black, we are now in the process of developing standards. And this is going to be my one moan and complaint in this presentation. Whereas in the United States, where there is a clear ring-fenced budget required by the US federal government that earmarks money specifically for peer-based recovery support services, all of the promise made through the Dame Carol Black review hasn't changed anything. And really, lived experience recovery organisations still rely primarily on crumbs from the table of the specialist treatment services. And that world hasn't changed. The science has improved, our coordination has improved, our visibility and credibility have improved through Clero and through the earlier work of Favour and ongoing work of Favour. But nonetheless, the situation where there's big uplifts, and again, those big uplifts are going to be, I guess, primarily directed through the mainstream treatment providers. And I'm not saying for a second they don't deserve it, but support for lived experience recovery organisations remains inadequate and insufficient. So, rant over. So there are 3 phases of the recovery movement as far as I can tell. Phase 1, it was all about 12-step meetings, church halls, bad coffee, anonymous fellowship stuff. It was seen as a kind of cult, and at the same time, since the 1960s or 70s, the other anonymous, but anonymous in a different way of a recovery way of dealing with addiction problems was rehabs and therapeutic communities, big houses in the hill in the middle of nowhere. People were sent away and they were expected to come back 6 months later being fixed or cured. Recovery was something that was dirty, secret, and hidden. Now, both of these things remain absolutely essential elements of any effective recovery model. 12-step has a huge evidence base behind it. Residential rehab and particularly therapeutic communities also have a strong supportive evidence base. But, and for any of you who've seen the anonymous people, there is a second phase where we started getting this sense of recovery as something that is visible, accessible, where people weren't hidden and shamed and hidden away. And that the world of recovery community organisations in America and lived experience recovery organisations in the UK allowed us to develop Clero as something that is out there and active and actively engaged in the community, not in specialist centres. We have recovery activities, recovery celebrations. But crucially, for me, the third phase of a recovery model is about how do we make communities better places for everybody? No longer should recovery be something exclusively anonymous and hidden. No longer should it occasionally be about an annual walk and an occasional fair. It's about social enterprise, active participation, or as my colleague from DATIS in Birmingham, Jamie Sadler, would say, reciprocal altruism. We are not volunteering. We are offering and contributing something back to the community, and that is an exchange, not a handout begging for opportunities and freedoms. So this remarkable picture is remarkable because it is my home city of Glasgow and it's not raining. In fact, for the second UK Recovery Walk, it was bright sunshine. And I merely put this up, one, because I love this picture. And if you look next to the lamppost, in among all these relaxed, happy people celebrating, you'll see two slightly awkward looking men in suits. One of them is me, and the person next to me is Fergus Ewing, who's the Scottish Government Minister for Communities at the time. Why? Because this was an act of political pressure group activity, which is what the recovery movement needs to be. And at that time, the idea here was to champion the idea of recovery as a community thing. And now, one of my next challenges and tasks is to say, can we start mapping out how effective visible recovery becomes? Because it seems to me recovery celebrations have 7 primary purposes. 1, to celebrate the achievement of recovery. 2, to bring people together in recovery. 3, to challenge stigma among the general public. And in this Glasgow walk, we had loads of people. This is Glasgow Green. We had loads of people coming up to us asking what was going on. 4, for people not yet in recovery to demonstrate that recovery is visible and possible. 5, to create that kind of political pressure group. 6, to contribute to the community well-being by adding an extra event in the community calendar for everybody, not just those people in recovery. 7, to create what we call bridging and linking capital to bring people not in the recovery community together with people in the recovery community to create stronger communities. I'm just coming up to the end. So for 10 years or so now, we've talked about ROSCs, which are recovery-oriented systems of care. And for me, we need to amend that model to think about how recovery communities actively contribute to the well-being of communities, to challenge stigma, to increase accessible community resources, to provide a sense of giving back, contributing, dynamism, and social enterprise. An inclusive recovery city is a city where the implementation of recovery models and principles make the city a better place to live for everyone, and which implements a recovery-oriented system at a city level. And just to give you an example, that I think we had the launch of our Inclusive Recovery Cities event in Middlesbrough in the Riverside Football Stadium in May. We now have 10 British recovery cities. We have 14 between Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia. We are now developing recovery cities in the United States and Canada. And I have a call at the end of this week in Cape Town in South Africa to see if they can join. We also have long-established recovery cities in Ghent, in Belgium, and in Gothenburg in Sweden. This is a model about challenging stigma, creating opportunity, creating new social connections, and building opportunities that shift beyond simply a recovery community. I have covered a lot of stuff, and I'm very pleased, Mia and Maisie, that I've managed to stick pretty much to time. The core kind of ideas here are CHIME: connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and purpose, meaning and empowerment. Recovery capital is predicated on the idea of communities, that it's a 3-way dynamic relationship between personal, social, and community capital. Recovery is a social contagion that spreads from one person in recovery to another. For professionals, the mirror idea is cascades, to create the opportunities for that social contagion to occur. The model that we are working on to develop this is called Inclusive Recovery Cities. And this is the transition from recovery as a social model to recovery as an ecological model. Thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you so much, David. And so I think we've got a good amount of time for questions. So if we just sort of get everyone to raise their hand who's got any questions, and then obviously we'll just go between you. So we'll start with Ben. Ben, have you got a question? Nope.
You're still on mute, Ben, if you do have a question.
Morning. I think I'm with the group now. Thank you ever so much, David. Brilliant presentation this morning. Excellent. I'm sure everyone will agree with attended. The knowledge and the stats and the kind of professionalism around the way that you speak and present is amazing. What I was asking is, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned, David, about 5 years is kind of the base mark for people in recovery to kind of get to that stable recovery. Yeah. What we're finding, David, in Doncaster in particular, and the organisation that I work for, Project 6 at Doncaster, is that, you know, we're doing it, people are finding that a lot less than 5 years. Is that something you hear a lot in the work that you do, David?
It isn't. And first, thank you very much, Ben, for your really kind comment. So that's really good of you. Second, you know, basically, it's like we also typically say the typical length of an addiction career is 28 years. But I would argue that the variability of that is around personal recovery capital. Because sadly, as you will also be aware, Ben, there are people for whom it is much longer than 5 years. It's a journey where there are many kind of slips and challenges along the way, and it's definitely a non-linear process. So, but one of the things I think you should think of as encouraging there is if you're typically seeing less than 5 years, it may well imply that the levels of social and community capital you have available are stronger than they might be in other places, and that allows you to perhaps bring that average time down. Look, you know, the science of this is still early, so we're still trying to work out some of those things that predict. Now, my thought would be people who either haven't lost their recovery capital from pre-addiction, or who are able to access jobs, friends and houses pretty well, they will have much stronger and faster recovery journeys. It's always going to be individualized. And I think that the key thing to say is, these are scientific averages over hundreds of thousands of people that vary massively in geography as well as in their personal circumstances. So I hope that's a helpful answer.
It is, David, thank you. Just to kind of continue on that for a little bit, for a couple of seconds if I can. Yeah, I get it, it's an individual thing, and that's absolutely fundamental to what we kind of try and do with this organisation. But I've just been commissioned to be the LERO lead for Doncaster Project 6, and I'd say I've been doing it since January now at Doncaster, but it's still in its infancy. It's growing incrementally, and to have the guidance through the LERO and the standards that are along the way, I believe it would be revolutionary. There is a lot of grey area around what we're doing.
Well,
sorry, go on.
Ben, if you want, there are also wonderful standards that colleagues of mine have developed in the States for recovery community organisation. I'd be more than happy to send them to you if you drop me an email.
That'd be so handy. Thank you, David. I won't take any more of the time up after the others are wanting to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much, Ben. I think, David, you next have your hand up.
Good morning, all, and thanks for the presentation, David. And it's nice to see a name check for Datus as well. So thank you for that.
Oh, great.
I had two questions, and I think you've answered the first one, because I remember a paper you did with Ed Day about 20 years ago saying that the life cycle was about 10 years. I think you've answered that by saying that it varies. So I won't move much further on that. But I'm really interested in that bit at the beginning. Someone to love, something to do, somewhere to live. I would maybe summarise that as purpose. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that summary, whether that fits or whether it doesn't fit. And I'm quite happy if you'd say it doesn't. Or if you would summarise those three things in a different way.
Yeah, so let me start with the notion of the prerequisites. It seems to me that you absolutely have to have some kind of safe, stable housing. And I think one of the big commissioning gaps and challenges at the moment is around getting recovery housing models effective. And I'm in the lucky position, I get to see these in America all the time, where there are highly effective models for getting people either homeless or from jail into recovery residences, which definitely helps. Purpose, yeah. So look, one of the things that Ed and I also argued probably 10 or 15 years ago was that, you know, one of the big benefits of group belonging and group identity, whether it's to a LERO or 12-step group or whatever is, it confers that sense of meaning and purpose for people. Giving people a sense of social identity gives them some positive values. And it doesn't, you know, one of the things I think about this stuff is, and that's crucial about all recovery theories is, it may start with the assumption that people at the start of the recovery journey are different in some ways because of their needs and the addiction problems they've had. But the idea is, at the end, it becomes existential problems that everyone faces. That as people progress in the recovery journey, those are just standard questions about meaning and purpose. And I have a wonderful PhD student at the moment called Kevin, who's looking at late versus onset drinkers in recovery. And really a lot of his work is about how people develop that sense of meaning and purpose, say when their children leave home or when they retire, and the challenges that creates. So I wouldn't agree with you at all, Dave. I think it crucially is a question about purpose and meaning is central. I would argue that the way of helping people develop that is through social and community capital.
Thank you, David. And I'm quite interested in that late onset bit. Do you know when that work is coming out?
Some of it's out again. So one of the papers is Kevin McInerney. He's published his literature review, and his PhD exam will be in springtime next year. Drop me an email and I'll send you the paper he's done so far.
Thanks, David. Thanks again.
Not a problem.
Perfect. Thank you. I think Mary Greener, you had your hand up next. So yeah, please take it away with your question.
Hi there. Thank you very much, David, for that really interesting and inspiring presentation. I just wanted to mention something, which is that I'm down in Cornwall and we don't have a lot of cities in Cornwall. So thinking about the concept of recovery cities. So what we have in Cornwall is lots of rural areas. Sometimes you get a kind of string of little hamlets that don't have many people living in them, connected by two small towns. And one of the things that we're struggling with is how we can make LEROs really meaningful for those small communities. And I just wondered if you had any ideas about that.
Yeah, well, and Mary, it's a really important point, and something that I've been criticised for rightly over the course of my career is about being too urban-centric. You know, virtually all of my time I've worked in Glasgow or Birmingham or London or some big city. Now, the key there is transport, and there's a wonderful recovery city and recovery community in West Virginia, and I'm just going to take this opportunity. I know that's not really answering your question, it's a bit self-indulgent, but I'm going to do it anyway, sorry Mary. But there's a wonderful recovery community called Seed Sower, and Seed Sower is a series of women's recovery residences. And they're in small ex-mining towns in the heart of the opioid crisis in America and West Virginia. And women who live in the recovery residences have to agree to work in one of 4 bakeries in small towns in rural West Virginia. And they effectively, the fruits of labor cafes have become like beacons for the recovery community across what's a very diverse and underpopulated area. But what has been key for them has been developing transportation models. So they have effectively managed to get 2 minibuses from the state, and they are the core to this. So effectively, they sweep people up, they train people up as drivers, that's one of the opportunities, and they provide transportation services that are state funded. So yeah, it's not a perfect solution. And I know the temptation is to say, use online services and like online recovery groups. But when we did that European study I mentioned, people said it's like community without connection or connection without community. It's the idea that you get together, but you lose the richness and quality of face-to-face contact. So I think transport is a much more important solution than trying to switch everything online. And it's not a perfect solution, Mary. I realise that there are other stigmatisation issues in rural settings that possibly people in cities don't face as well. But getting people physically moving is crucial.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And I think whether it's Sierra or Cara, Carty, you're on.
Thanks, Mia. It's Ciara. I'm over in Dublin. David, thanks so much. And we've had the pleasure of some of your lectures over on the Trinity side with Johanna. I study with Johanna under the addiction recovery masters, but my role is working in homeless services in Dublin, and I'm really interested in that whole area of where people move. You know, they've have their own lived experience, and they've had a stable recovery, but they move into professional roles. And I wonder, do you have any kind of understand or thoughts on, you know, what elements of recovery capital are propelling people to move into the profession, and kind of and is there anything that organizations that employ people who have lived experience, you know, what we need to nurture to make sure that we, if there are important pieces to consider, that we don't, it's not to say over professionalize, but I think getting that balance right between professionals who have lived experience, that they're able to use that recovery capital, and organizations respecting that, and you know.
Yeah, this is a really key point. And I mean, I think one of the challenges with this is quite often people have what Shad Maruna referred to as redemption narratives. You know, they want to work in the drug and alcohol field because they feel as if they need to give something back and to help people unlearn the mistakes they made. And, you know, so that there's a very strong commitment. And for me, I think one of the risks of this is, for some people, you're almost tempted to say, go and try other stuff, at least in the interim, develop your skill base. Because I think one of the challenges, I've seen it throughout my career, well, firstly is tokenism. So when I worked at the Maudsley, we used to have people in recovery or service users sit on job interviews, and it was patronising and it was appalling and it was incredibly unhelpful. And then when I worked in Australia, Carolica was one of the therapeutic communities that, as required for federal funding, had to start employing up with like two worlds in there. Culturally, they just didn't merge. So you ended up with a group of people who were like traditional TC workers who were graduates. And for me, you know, there's an important thing about Warrior Down, that you have to have safety nets in place and not assume it's a linear pathway. And the transition to work can be very difficult for people. But it's absolutely crucial that all staff and all management engage in that culture change process, because to fit into a workplace, there's a real strong social identity question about, am I one of us or am I one of them? And, you know, having that sense of being able to, the other thing I think, which, you know, is recognized internationally, is qualifications are really weak and poor for people in recovery. You know, the idea it's like recovery coaching and then you become a kind of outreach worker, or you know, that the real stereotyped. And Dave Hyam from the Well will frequently use the phrase of professionals with lived experience. And I think that's a language change we need to start moving to, and to start thinking about how people become duly qualified. You know, they have their lived experience plus other qualifications and pathways. And our Centre for Addiction Recovery Research is about to open, and not in competition with Johanna, but we're going to be setting up a master's in peer recovery leadership to try and create a kind of meaningful qualification for people in that long-term recovery pathway, so that it'll be no different from a master's in public health or the master's in criminology that I have. It should have exactly the same academic status and credibility, partly to try and address that sense of slightly patronizing, slightly to one side, not part of general pathways to promotion. And there are some wonderful LEROs which are exclusively populated by people in recovery, and that's a great thing, but it doesn't have to be like that. I don't know if I've answered the question. I do feel as if I ranted rather than...
Oh, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks, David.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Kyle, you're next.
Thank you, David, first and foremost, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I gained a large sense of hope from it, and as someone who is a case manager for dual diagnosis team, I come from that kind of revolving door, as you say. So hearing those statistics really kind of put things into perspective for me. I also recall you mentioning the importance of a strength-based approach, and it kind of chimed in with me again around all of the outcome measures that we take. What have you been using in the past 4 weeks, and tell me about all your safeguarding concerns, all that sort of stuff. And I also find that working closely with the sort of doctors, psychiatrists, and the medical team, often the medical model and the approach can also uphold those kind of power imbalances too. So I kind of wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on how we can integrate strength-based approach into the medical route as well.
Yeah, look, and the problems you outline also apply at least to the same extent in justice, where there's this predominance of risk-focused work where RNR tends to dominate. And look, I think some of it is just about thought and structure. Ideally, I would have thought in every service, in an ideal world, you have somebody who has been through that service, has done well, and is an attractive role model, has been pretty much the first person people see. So if you can have a lived experience, successful role model, wonderful, because what more could you ask for if you're coming into a service than meeting somebody? But then some of it is just about basic human stuff, is to take people for a cup of tea and offer them a biscuit and say, what do you want? What can we do for you? Rather than immediately get, I'm astonished how well qualified professionals immediately start producing huge chunks of questionnaires and forms to fill in. It is fundamentally a human process, Kyle. And for me, that relational quality is just essential. To give people a sense of feeling safe, welcome, and cared about is much more important on the first visit than any form filling. And when I was at the Maudsley, there was all this kind of head scratching about why so many people never came back after the first appointment. Well, it's not surprising if you immediately ask them, a stranger is asking them deeply personal, stigmatizing and embarrassing questions, and isn't offering them any hope. So one of the things we do with a rec cap is the 4 open-ended questions we ask are all about: where are you? What do you want? What's next? Who do you have, and what do you have you can rely on to help you get to where you want to go? So it's personalized as much as anything else. And the other stuff is that is well documented in the addictions field is you come into a room that's full of signs that say, don't do this, don't do that, no alcohol, no drugs, no swearing, no fighting. And it's horrible. It's like dehumanizing. And when I worked at the Maudsley in the methadone maintenance clinic, we used to have this appalling system of, we ended up with bank security doors where people would have to come through the first door and it'd be locked behind, and then the second door would open, then they'd get breath tested, and then they'd have to swallow some orange or water to make sure they weren't doing spitbacks. It was all those things just to make people feel dehumanized and excluded. So I would always encourage peer-based processes, and then just think about what is the way you can maximize meaningful human connection in all contacts you have with people. That's a remarkably apple pie simplistic thing to say, so I'm really sorry if that's not very helpful.
No, it really, really is helpful. And I will be going away and having some conversations with sort of key stakeholders in looking at incorporating the rec cap form into the way that we do our kind of assessments and outcomes as well. So yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Kyle.
Thanks, David. Thanks for your question, Kyle. And next we've got Nick with your hand up. Nick, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank you, David, and also Mia and Macy for running this. These have been excellent events. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, is the red cap available? Secondly, what's the best website to follow some of the stuff you've been talking about? Do you have site yourself? And
I do.
Your email address?
Oh, I do indeed. Well, email address is easy. So it's just d.best@leedstrinity.ac.uk. And I will, if I can work out how I'll put that in the chat now. Yeah, let me see if I can do that.
I can get it in, David. That's all right.
Perfect. That's fine. Sadly, I fall into that sadly male stereotype of there's no way I can multitask. Drop me an email and I'll tell you about the various ways you can either use the RECCAP or the RCS 36. More than happy to talk to you about that offline. So yes, they are available and we can definitely do something around that. Perfect. And thank you for the question. I can't remember. Was there another bit? I think I'm now getting question fatigue.
No, email and website.
Oh, website, yeah. My website is called cultivatingrecoverycapital.com.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David.
Perfect.
Perfect. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So Alan Hagger, please take it away with your question.
Thank you. Yeah, as with everyone else, I mean, that was a great presentation and really inspiring. And I will want to listen to it all again when we get the recording. And I will look at your website. I'm doing some work on trying to encourage. Well, one of the things I'm doing is trying to encourage people when they're coming out of prison into support services. And so I'm looking at what the range of things that we can do, and what range of things that we can provide as local authorities to encourage people to engage with us. And I totally get your point about, you know, people arriving and us asking details about their private life. I don't want that. What I'm wanting to do is, how best can we engage with people? What can we offer to people? Yep. And I've got some, you know, we can go into the prison, we can talk to people. I'm wanting to talk to people, but I want to know how best to do that as well. So have you got any advice on that?
Yes, and let me start by I briefly mentioned a project that I'm doing in Chesterfield County Jail, which is a genuinely democratic therapeutic community run in a US jail. And it's just astonishing because the key challenges, I'm sure you know, Alan, is the through the gate challenge. People come out of prison, and then they disappear. Good intentions, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, and then they disappear and you never see them again. And both of the things I'm going to mention, so they are both peer-driven and they're both continuity of care models. So in Chesterfield HARP, Helping Addicts Recover programme, basically they are assigned on release to go straight to one of 3 recovery residences in Virginia. And how it works, though, is ex-prisoners who currently live in the recovery houses come and get them. And astonishingly, and I find this hard to imagine in this country, but people in the recovery residences go back into jail voluntarily on a weekly basis to continue taking part in the programme. In other words, there is much less of a bridge between the prison and the community. And the bridge is populated by peers who are already partly over that bridge. Now, that might sound like a ludicrously fantastic model, and it's the second name check for The Well. The Well is a recovery community organisation in Barrow-in-Furness and across Cumbria and bits of Lancashire. And I evaluated for them a model they had where they provided a 1 day at a time programme in HMP Alt course in Liverpool. And then the same people who were delivering those one-to-one sessions with people were also there through the gate connections to get those people into recovery communities. So there were 2 things. The first was the building up of a relationship. The second was a very clear and direct bridge from the prison to the recovery community that's proactive and assertive and led by ideally people on their own recovery journey. Now, again, Alan, both of them are now published journal papers, and I can send them to you. You know, please. I think for me, one of the massive challenges of that model is, you know, it is trying to avoid a situation where the community connectors working for prisons have no real direct links into the recovery communities, and they're not people who are trusted at the point of departure for prison. And, you know, I realize it's difficult at the moment. It's chaos. Category D prisons are now kind of Category C overspills. There's all kinds of challenges with the prison system, but it seems to me that that model, I think, is now increasingly an evidence model.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan, and thank you so much, David. You've been fantastic throughout the session, and I'm sure while reading through the chat box, there's a lot of takeaways, a lot of kind of thoughts and feelings that they'll kind of be following up with you afterwards. So unfortunately, we're almost at 9:30, so we'll have to wrap up today. But as people may already be aware, we do a series of these virtual events every kind of 6 to 8 weeks or so. So with it being almost Christmas time, dare I say it, that next one will probably be in the new year, January time. So Maisie and I from Panoramic Associates will be following up with you all, as many people as we can, to talk about follow-up questions that you may have for us and for David, themes and ideas for the next breakfast briefing in terms of topics, and kind of any way we can continue collaborating in this way. So keep an eye out for an email from Maisie or I. We'll hopefully be following up with Teams meetings or something like that in the next couple of days. And all comments in regards to how people can link in with David in more detail, will connect you all through kind of emails, through conversations. And finally, there is a LinkedIn event page as well, which is a private page where you can all kind of talk, ask questions about anything, and then we can take it all from there. Maisie, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thank you very much, David. It was an excellent session, and yeah, look forward to catching up with everyone. Shouldn't be too much, just 5 to 10 minutes. It's just really, really important that we get some feedback and insight and drivers for the next one.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for your time.